Hello and welcome to another episode of Literary Gladiators, the show where we discuss and debate literature in all of its forms. If it's written work, it's game. Let's meet the panel.
Hi, I'm Larry.
Hi, I'm Jesi.
I'm Ari.
And I'm Josh. And Ari, welcome to our in-person discussions for Season 13.
Thank you.
Of Literary Gladiators. This is your 11th season. So today we are going to be going over a Herman Melville poem called The March into Virginia, ending in the First Manassas.
I'm going to pull it up on my phone here.
And you have a discussion starter, Jesi?
I do. So, I understand that it's an interesting poem to get through. I personally felt that I had to read it a few times to understand what it was saying. But how do you feel this kind of differentiates a poem about the battle as opposed to just historically talking?
I think that on the topic of the Civil War, Herman Melville was unique in how he's more like a 20th, the way that they approached war poetry in the 20th century, the 21st century, where it was a little bit more for its face value, and that's in a more negative light.
Mm-hmm.
In how,
like anti-war.
It's more anti-war, whereas Henry Wadsworth Longfellow with his Paul Revere's Ride was bringing together enthusiasm for the Civil War effort. And even Walt Whitman was more, outside of, Captain My Captain was a mooring of Lincoln, but his poetry, speaking of the Civil War, was a little bit more enthusiasm for the country, whereas Melville, his enthusiasm for just war in general was weak.
Yes.
Just the way that he said, the fact that he sees it overall as being boyish, and that the real winners are those in the state.
Yeah. There's this enthusiasm for the state is what leads to the war and that kind of an attitude.
Those are the ones that really win, are the people that the leaders, the ones that get affected the most, are the soldiers fighting on either side.
It's like the puppets and the puppeteers.
I had to do a little bit of background research on it. And for those who don't know, the First Manassas is the Battle of Bull Run, which is something I learned.
It's the first land battle
Yes.
of the Civil War, because Fort Sumter was fought on sea.
Yes. So it's interesting because as you go through the different stanzas, it kind of lets you know, or how he writes it lets you know kind of how people thought of the war. Like the first one, it's supposed to kind of, people didn't think the Civil War was going to last as long as it did. They thought it was going to be something short, quick, and sweet. Like it was just a little, we're disagreeing, but we'll get over it.
I don't think it ever runs up that way.
Not anymore. It was prior to the war starting. This was just it. Nobody really kind of saw it as big of a deal as it actually was. And the Battle of Bull Run gave the Confederates the confidence that they needed to kind of keep fighting a little bit, and it helped prolong the war even more. So even though the Union had a lot more technology and more of the industrialization that was needed to win the war, the Confederates still felt that they had the ability to keep fighting.
What you said makes sense, because you say that it was supposed to only be a short battle, but obviously just look at the first line of the second stanza. Who here forecasted this event?
Exactly.
We didn't know it was going to happen. It's just the dominoes fall and the page turned and the Yoshis became happier.
And the First Manassas is one of like the major battles of the Civil War. And a lot of people also, I feel like now when we go through history books, we don't realize
solidified the Confederate Army at that time, and Stonewall Jackson was probably one of the strongest generals during the Civil War effort.
Yes. And it's interesting because, again, our history books only cover, like, major points, like Gettysburg, Bull Run, Fort Sumter, the major events, that I'll call them. But the Civil War was incredibly bloody and deadly.
There were things
And
like every day.
Every
There was
day.
some kind of conflict almost every day.
And so where I live now is where the majority of the Civil War was fought. So they
That's
have
Virginia, right?
Yeah, the northern, like Winchester. I actually like 2 months ago went on a hike through the 3rd Winchester battlefields because they were constantly fighting there, and so they have battlefields everywhere, and there's so much history that you learn just from those little things that you find along the trail. And we kind of, and I think that's what he's trying to portray here, is that this was a major event that was kind of the catalyst for something even more.
I did a bold statement that, with the exception of the last line, the aftershock Manassas share, which you can just replace the name, I feel like if you change this title to the march into area ending in the war, you'd get, this poem would still be relevant. Like, I feel this could be for many different events during the Civil War. Now, obviously, the Bull Run was the first big one, but I feel like a lot of these phrases could also be used to describe the feelings of the people who were going to during the Civil War.
I think that ultimately it did have a lot to say about Melville's approach and his views on war itself, which it's also interesting that by this time, because Melville was known for his prose, which is reflected in Moby Dick and his shorter works, but for a period of time, for about 30 years, beginning in the early 1860s, all he wrote was poetry, and the Civil War had a huge role, because he was reporting as a civilian, or he's writing as a civilian. He went onto the Virginia battlefields in 1864, so it had been after. Some of them were during, but the major battles had. By that time, the Union was in a stronger place, because leading up to Gettysburg, the Union lost 10 battles, and there was one draw in Antietam.
Yeah.
But
which I think is still known as one of the bloodiest battles in American history, like top 2 or 3.
I always think that draws are just the worst, because it means everyone technically loses.
Chancellorsville was the Confederates' strongest win. However, that was the one that cost Stonewall Jackson's life. And
Josh, I have a question for you and for everyone here. Does anyone read Herman Melville's? He had another poem a couple years later called Shiloh.
I have not. I haven't
heard
read
of it.
I have.
I think so. I heard of it because when I was researching a poem to suggest for us to go over, I came across it and decided on this one instead. It's a longer one.
Yeah, this one. It's shorter than this one.
It's shorter.
Slightly
Okay.
But it reminds me very much. I mean, obviously same author, same time period, but it definitely had a lot of. I think you said that Herman Melville was known for his prose, but reading Shiloh, and also reading the Manassas.
By the 1860s, he started more with his poetry.
And I think his poetry is wonderful.
But he released a collection of Civil War poetry called Battle Pieces and Aspects of the War, and that was in 1866. But
5 years after this poem was made, the Manassas poem.
Yeah, but after it was set.
Yeah.
Yeah, before his, he died in 1891. He did release one more novel, Billy Budd. When you were talking about his acclaim, he really started to pick up acclaim in the 1920s, which is when a lot of your figures in American literature started to pick up acclaim, because back in the 19th century, people were more so reading British literature. They were reading Shakespeare and Dickens. Dr. Bordelon actually did his doctoral thesis on the topics.
And it wasn't just with
what were Americans reading.
And it wasn't just with literature. I mean, you look at someone like Vincent van Gogh, who's 1891, so that's 19th century, late 19th century, and he wasn't really well known until after he died.
He died in 1890.
Yeah, that's what I mean. He died in 1890. Sorry about that.
But yeah, it was.
He was around the same time.
Once America starts to develop its own long-standing history, works like this become only fitting, and I think it's a great thing to have Melville's perspective, because it's a little bit more honest. The sugarcoating that takes place goes to the extent of martyrizing Custer, who, if you look at the history books, Custer ultimately, there were people that were able to write his biographies that made him a fallen hero, when in actuality he was a raging alcoholic who was just mad and...
I think the other thing too is, like the Civil War, we grow up learning about it in every single history class, every single year. But like you said, it is kind of, it's sugar-coated. And I mean, I appreciate history, and I thought I knew a decent amount. I mean, I know more ancient history than I know American history. But it's just interesting to learn, as far as blood, death, gore, weapons go, the Civil War was a turning point in American history. And I mean, we grew up hearing, oh, brothers were fighting brothers, family was fighting family. It's like, okay, whatever. It's like, no, this was a major...
They're saying the word fight, but they're not getting into what the fights were,
exactly.
what they used.
That, as Ari said, that applies to any kind of war.
Yeah. And you don't really see it until, like, the aftermath, how bad it really gets. And, I mean, war is bad. But, it's...
I mean, if you go back even to the Revolutionary War, there were some really deadly things, like the Boston Massacre. That was Revolutionary War, wasn't it?
Yep.
And that was...
it
was before
American
the
Revolution.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the worst events in history, and, even now you're getting stuff similar to that, so...
Well, you got the Battle of Trenton, right? You got George Washington coming over on Christmas Day.
That
ambush and
surprise attack. And then George Washington going, I'm sailing away.
So, just to kind of throw something in here, I did actually, 2 Christmases ago, convince my family that instead of doing a traditional Christmas morning, let's go to Trenton. And we went and we watched the reenactment of Washington crossing the Delaware, and I actually learned a ton, and it's really cool. So if you guys, they do it 2 times during the month of December, so you don't have to go on Christmas. But they do like the initial crossing where he goes over, and then they do another crossing when he comes back. And highly recommend you guys check it out. It's really cool, and you do learn a lot, but it's incredible because if it weren't for the Battle of Trenton, the Americans would never have had the confidence they needed to actually stand up to the British. Like, that was a major turning point during the American Revolution, and if George Washington did not do what he did, and also New Jerseyans, the people of New Jersey at that time sympathized with the British, and then the British kind of screwed them over. So what they did was they came up with this with militia that were like sectionalized, so that way when the Britons took over Trenton, they would attack in waves.
We were the cockpit of the Revolutionary War.
That was the Minutemen, weren't they?
Yeah, it was something like that, and it was just like, okay, they attacked, and then they'd be like, okay, we're done. And it's like, nope, here comes another attack. Why this one rested, and then here comes another attack. Why they rested, and so it was like they were constantly attacking. The British never got the rest they needed, and then George Washington.
I think that
took
confidence, though, over the years, slowly, may have turned into kind of like a arrogance or a my opinion is better than yours kind of attitude, and that's what splits the country in 2 during the Civil War. So while there's good things, there's also some bad things. And even now, it's not just 2 things. It's like
everything.
a million everything. Every person's like, I gotta be this way, and this person's gotta be this way.
Everybody has.
But it all starts with the formation of a country through war.
Everybody lives in a glass house, but they're more than willing to throw a lot of stones.
That's
the problem.
Something my friend made that expression the other day, and I said, well, if I live in a glass house, it's probably going to be 130 degrees. I'll probably grow some tropical plants in there.
That's a good idea.
But it's true. We're in a country that's been born of war. We average a major war every 20 years in this country. Now we've been in 2 wars for 20 years.
It's an instrument of policy, which is a shame. It's not the way it should be.
No.
And I feel like war is talked about, very like I feel like everybody knows war is bad and that we shouldn't be fighting wars constantly, but we use the term so lightly, war, and that nobody really feels the actual weight.
I always say, and I've said this for years, this is something that I kind of came up with when I was in my teens. War is just another way of saying disagreement by enforcement. It's just, you can use those words, so that you can take disagreement by enforcement. Let's say Josh likes the color blue, and I like the color red, and I think that his decision's stupid. That is essentially, it's a war, it's a conflict. And it's something ridiculous, but it's still, if like a million people like color red and a million people like the color blue, and they want to attack each other for it, I mean, how ridiculous.
Kind of that's how they satirize it in Duck Soup. Marx Brothers.
And by the way, that was not a political thing. That was actually just like plain colors I'm talking about here. I just
not talking about Republicans against Democrats.
No, not at all. That's not what I'm referencing. Because that's more complicated.
Alrighty then.
No politics.
Final thoughts?
I do have one final thought. It's more of a historical fact that you guys might not know about that relates to the Civil War. Did you know that, you guys know what the Mason-Dixon line is, right?
Of course, I hyped it.
Yeah. So the Mason-Dixon line, I believe, stops like right around the east coast of Virginia-ish, kind of.
Yeah,
I'm not entirely sure where,
Maryland.
but here's the thing: if Mason and Dixon, or whatever the thing was, if they were able to continue that line, do you know that Cape May would have been in the Confederacy?
Oh wow!
It kind of makes a little.
The entirety of Cape May County would be in the Confederacy. My mom told me this just the other day, so I thought it would be relevant. But
that's very interesting.
It is interesting, but it's also interesting that, or another thing that I was going to make mention of the fact that have you heard about the last battle of the Civil War, Palmetto Star?
I've heard of it.
About 500 people lost their lives. The Confederates actually won that battle. It really wasn't. By that time, Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, so it didn't necessarily contribute. Being granted, the South still won the peace.
I was just thinking of that South Park episode, the red badge of GAY-ness, where like Cartman literally like gets everyone drunk just so the South like wins. In modern times, it's messed up, but it's
yeah. South Park is messed up.
I don't really watch it anymore.
It's just the Civil War was really brutal, right? I guess in a way, wasn't it kind of like the first modern war? Didn't you say that?
So actually, that's what I was trying to make a point before, was that the Union had all of the industry, and the South provided less industry and more crop. And that's why, you needed both the Union and the South to work together to have a successful country, because the South has all the crops, they have no food, but they have all the weapons. And so that's what made it such a bloody battle, was because the North had modern technology, and they were fighting the South, and the South had no idea until it was too late. And then, people are just being almost totally decimated.
And what doomed things is that they relied on abolition to keep the crops going, but abolition in itself is immoral.
Yeah, and that's why before the war started, and if you guys get a chance to, when you come down to visit, take a look at Harper's Ferry. It's a national park where they touch base on it in history class. John Brown. Does anybody remember John Brown? He's depicted as a crazy person, but he went and freed the slaves in Harper's Ferry, and they took over the armory, and that was basically, that's the main source of the South's weaponry. So another reason why most of the war was fought in the Shenandoah Valley is because that's where Harper's Ferry was, and that's where the South were getting most of their guns. So if the North could take that, then the South had nothing, and so it was just constantly changing hands. And it's in a valley where the Potomac and the Shenandoah River meet. So it's a very interesting spot to have battles. It doesn't really work, but
It'd be really interesting to see how history would have rolled out, had that war been avoided.
Mm-hmm.
Would there still be slavery in the South, or would they have come to their senses? And
Would the Confederate flag exist?
yeah, would the Confederate flag exist? Would states still have more rights?
Or would
Would
they
people still feel loyal to the states in a way that they don't anymore? Right? Like, I mean, that's one thing that you think about with the Civil War was a lot of those people were fighting not over the issue of slavery, but just because of the
most
fact
of them
that their
didn't have an
state-
opinion.
Yeah, it was just because their state was asking them to.
I know, like
It really was.
a lot of people feel that the South.
Robert E. Lee, the reason he fought on the Confederate side is because his family was from Virginia. So he was his ideology was the opposite.
Yeah.
And that was the thing. A lot of people don't even realize that Virginia, and this is my best understanding of it based on the things that I've been reading lately, being that's where I'm from now. Virginia wasn't even really part of the North or part of the South. Virginia was one giant battlefield because that was where the North and the South met.
Yeah.
And like
So that whole line
kind
about
of
brother
middle
against
ground.
brother was
It-
no more true than in Virginia.
yeah, and it was like it's
That's
just
probably why it's
scary.
called Virginia.
Yeah.
It's a version, so it hasn't like picked either side.
No, it was.
I think it was called
named for
Virginia
the Queen.
beforehand.
Yeah,
Ah, okay.
it was
But
a royal name.
It is very interesting
Because that
and-
was that's the original colony.
Yeah, Roanoke.
Jamestown.
yeah, Jamestown,
Jamestown.
and then Richmond was after that, right?
I thought
Jamestown
Roanoke
down here,
was-
and then Richmond's there.
Roanoke was one of them.
Roanoke is way over here.
Yeah.
It's
Was
more
that the one
inland.
that? Which one was the one that fell? Wasn't there one that fell?
Anyway,
Everybody
Oh no,
disappeared.
Roanoke's still there. So, but yeah, no, I just and again, you know, you can still see remnants of that, and a lot of my new friends and even some of my future family members, you know, they go metal detecting, and you can still find pieces of this history, Confederate and Union belt buckles in the same spot where people died, and it got so bad there that there was no point in even clearing out bodies.
That's those
Wow.
those kind of releases are for historical means. It's more not because the Confederate flag is now viewed in a politically incorrect fashion
yeah.
for what it stands for.
Yeah.
But there sometimes when you historically put the two together, you have this is what the other side looked like. So by historical means, it's necessary to show that this is what the Confederate flag was. But you also have to make point to the fact that this is what it stood for.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people like they stand for what they believe what this stand for the Confederate
Yes.
flag, but like
There's-
I also know people who are like you can't do that. I mean, I think it should more be like if you want to, that's what you want to do.
It stood for. I mean, on one hand, there's the argument that it stands for states' rights, but on the other hand, it also stands for the fact that
White supremacy.
these people did. Yeah, the act of abolition was necessary when, in actuality, it was immoral.
Yeah, I think it depends on who you're talking to and who's holding it. I
Yes.
feel like a lot of people, you know, forget that it is a part of our history, and those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.
Yes.
Not saying that we're going to bring slavery back anytime soon, but you know, any sort of
Never
thing
really
can
went
happen.
anywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
This just went underground. That's all.
So exactly, it's if we can't just go and erase and forget this. It is something that we
We have to remember and
acknowledge
learn
remember
from
It's
and
like a
learn
Holocaust.
from it. Exactly.
You gotta these fights and as you said, the quality of those fights and what happened. It's so important that we just know that they happened and never forget.
And I think Herman Melville does, and I didn't know that he did a lot of Civil War poetry, so this is something that I learned from him. But with this poem, I feel like he kind of captures it nicely in a way that it's not, bringing about enthusiasm for the war. Because you don't want to bring about enthusiasm. As we said, these are families fighting families. These are Americans fighting Americans.
The interesting thing he
Innocent
kind of
people
does.
are dying.
People are dying.
He does kind of
unnecessarily.
He kind of does make it enthusiastically, but not the actual fighting. He's talking about it's like moving gaily or whatever. Like
I think he was talking more.
He's talking about the passions of getting into a war and looking at it as a glory instead of what I think he looks at it as more of a kind of a regrettable waste of life.
Yeah.
And we mentioned in a few discussions ago about how when Achilles, you have to almost become prideful when you're going and facing your death just to make it worth it. Whereas and I think that's what he's saying, is that these men are marching and to their deaths, and it's almost guaranteed that they're going to die on this battlefield. So of course they have to be happy about it, because how else are they going to get the courage to go and do it? And I think that's a point that he brings up, is like, just because you're full of pride to do it doesn't mean you should.
You look at the wars of post-enlightenment, right, where it's not the royals that are fighting the war anymore. So the people that decide to go to war get to sit home and send other people's children to die. Whereas in the Middle Ages and medieval, and even before that, it would be the king themselves would be on the battlefield. And there's glory in that, right? Like, I mean, because you're putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah.
You're willing to go out there and actually take the risk yourself that you're asking everybody else to take. That doesn't happen now.
There's one war, World War I, where something fabulous happened, and I wish that this could happen more often, and that's the 1917 Christmas armistice. I wish that, there were wars where people realize they're fighting, but they're still care for the other side. Like when things are the same, like when it's a holiday they all celebrate, or when it is
better if there was no war at all.
Yeah,
well, obviously, I'm saying, but that's not gonna.
Yeah.
I don't think that's very. I'm not sure that's possible. I mean,
that's great, hippie.
And that's what I think.
Let the sun shine.
And that, I think, was the worst part
See,
about
two
the
players.
Civil War, was that everybody was so torn that there are very few instances where, the one side remembered that the other side
Like they're
were
both
human.
American and Cuban. But the same country. We're the same. We all have, unless shrapnel blew off one of our fingers, we all have 10 fingers. We're all the same people. And honestly, like, we forget that sometimes. And when we forget that, that's when these kinds of things happen.
Yep.
And the more we've forgotten, the worse the fights usually are.
Well, the more that we can continue to talk and have difficult conversations, and we can hopefully not resort to this kind of violence, and be able to continue to be a country.
We got to be open books. So, if you haven't already watched it, make sure to watch Reading Rainbow.
Alrighty then, if you're interested in checking out this poem, I will leave a link down below to where you can find it. I actually read this one online, even though I do have some of Melville's poetry within my possession.
I'm gonna lay down my burden down by the riverside.
Be sure to join us next time on another episode of Literary Gladiators. For now, keep reading. Hi there, this is Josh, and on the next episode of Literary Gladiators, Larry, Jesi, Ari, and I will be discussing Abstracting the Rubik's Cube by Royce Nelson. It was featured in the Best Writing on Mathematics from 2019. If you like what you see on this channel, please support us on our Patreon, for the money that we make will allow us to provide you, the viewer, with more great content. For now, and as always, we encourage you to keep reading.